Welcome to week 4 of the Psychology of Organizational Development, Understanding Power and Evil in Organizations. Power dynamics in organizations and in societies rely on social narrative, on myths. Cultural narratives come with implicit assumptions at the deepest level, and these are invisible and often unconscious. And that gives them, and the people leading those stories, a lot of power. I will define key concepts that are related but distinct. Ideas like power, status, and dominance and submission. I want you to be able to recognize dominance and submission in human behavior. And we'll talk about evil in the workplace, how it comes from narcissism in individuals and organizational cultures. And I'll also discuss workplace bullying and mobbing as a form of evil that can befall us when we work in organizations. And last but not least, let's consider what it takes to be a good leader. Last week we talked about organizational culture, about how at the surface we can see it in artifacts like the clothing and the built environment in what we say. And under that there are values, and deeper under that there are implicit assumptions, statements about the world that we believe to be true and act based upon. Ideas like the teacher knows best. Those statements come together to form a story, a narrative. The teacher knows best. The teacher will help us learn. We should listen to the teacher. High grades are good and low grades are bad. We should be proud to get a high grade. We should study hard and try to get a high grade. Narratives can be understood as partly true and partly false. Most stories about how the world works and what happened are going to highlight and emphasize certain themes while selectively disregarding or suppressing other information. A functionalist perspective on narrative doesn't judge the narrative on whether it's literally true or false, or right or wrong, but rather as adaptive or maladaptive given a certain context and goal. Narratives are a guide to behavior. You do something because you believe a story, because you're following a social script. The question, is that story literally true, is less important than what are you going to do with that story. If the narrative is adaptive, it'll lead you to do something that promotes long-term well-being. If that story helps you achieve your goals in this class, and taking this class is actually worth your time, then that is an adaptive narrative. It's fairly reasonable to believe that a teacher knows what they're talking about and will help you learn. But what if you believed something that was pretty irrational? Let's say that you believe that if you fail to brush your teeth every night, the tooth fairy will tie knots in your hair while you sleep. Well, if that makes you brush your teeth every night, which say is the right thing to do, then that's an adaptive narrative because it made you brush your teeth. It's less important or even irrelevant that the tooth fairy actually doesn't exist. That would only matter if you did something foolish on account of your beliefs about tooth fairies. Say, sacrifice the child with the most beautiful teeth at the tooth fairy altar. Now, I saw something. It was an ad for a seminar, and it was called How to Be Positive in a Negative Environment. What does that mean? What does positive mean? It can mean a lot of things. It can mean to add something, in the case of positive punishment, like squirting water on your cat. It could mean that something is present in the sense of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, like having active delusions or hallucinations. It could mean that something is pleasant, that it's desirable, that it is ordered, that it is good in the sense of ethical or beneficial, or just free from the negative. In the context of adaptivism, it means to move toward a worthy goal. And then what does negative mean? It could mean to subtract something, like the absence of normal behavior and the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Could mean the removal of a desirable stimulus in negative punishment, like when you give a child a time out. Can mean unpleasant, undesirable, disordered, diseased, or bad. In the context of adaptivism, it means to move away from a worthy goal. We could speculate about what positive and negative mean in the context of this seminar. You might have some ideas. Maybe it means being upbeat around people who are really critical. We can speculate, and when we speculate that, we assume some kind of context, some culture, some microcosm. And without context, those words don't actually mean much at all. Those are words that refer to some kind of underlying social narrative or myth. Right? Behind those words, there's some narrative, some framework by which you assess what's good and what's bad. And when you use those words thoughtlessly and uncritically, as many people do, then the narrative controls you. So your next question needs to be, who controls the narrative? The title of that seminar, How to Be Positive in a Negative Environment, reified positivity and negativity. Reification is a kind of logical fallacy. It's when we take an abstract belief or construct and treat it as if it were a concrete thing with a real physical existence. Right? It's when we treat something that is really subjective and laden with value judgments as if it were a natural fact. That seminar talked about positivity and negativity as if they were somehow fact with no context. So reification functions to strip an idea of its social context so that you can't see it anymore, so you're not aware of it anymore. And it makes the framework by which positivity and negativity are judged, and those are value judgments, invisible to you. Here's another example of reification, and it's talking about an organization as if it were a human with a brain. So you'll hear statements like, the company cares about employees, or SMU values community. An organization is an abstraction. It is not a human with a brain. It cannot think. It cannot value. It cannot care. An organization does not and cannot care. Remember that before you go and bleed the company colors. It can, at best, have a culture that promotes caring behaviors in its members, who are human beings with minds and brains. It's the people that care, not the positions, not their structure of the positions that form the organization. But if we could get you to think that the company cares, what could we get you to do? There is no such thing as positive or negative states, traits, or behaviors. The assessment that an action is good, and that's the sense of positive we're using here. Okay, the assessment that an action is good is not inherent to the behavior, or the state, or the trait. Lying is bad when you are lying to me. Lying is good when you're telling the axe murderer where I'm hiding. So the assessment that something is positive depends on context. It depends on some moral or philosophical framework that's external to the thing itself. When you can't recognize that framework because you take it for granted and it's invisible to you, then you lay yourself open to being controlled by someone else's agenda. Because you have assumed it to be true and now use it as a guide to your action, it now controls you. The statement, employee engagement is positive, is something you might accept if you uncritically accept the values of OD as a discipline. But that statement is not universally true the way 2 + 2 equals 4 is true. Employee engagement may or may not be positive in the sense of adaptive or beneficial, depending on the context and the goal, right? It can be inefficient or risky. The discipline of positive organizational psychology reifies certain traits or states, those that are considered desirable by management, because IO psychology works for management, as positive. Positive organizational behavior is defined as the study and application of positively oriented human resource strengths and psychological capacities that can be measured, developed, and effectively managed for performance improvement. What that means is that it's studying anything that is useful to management for the benefit of management. And so what are these positive states or traits? Well, positive psychological capital, which is defined as an individual's confidence to exert effort in challenging tasks, make positive attributions about current and future results, persevering and redirecting goals as appropriate, and having the resilience to bounce back from failures. Wow, that's a lot, and it doesn't seem to really mean anything except try hard and keep trying. And what does making positive attribution about current and future results even mean? There are results of, I suppose, one's efforts, or maybe results of management, or maybe results of the organization, and your assessments will be positive. Positive psychological capital is supposed to be a composite construct, so it's bunching together of a few different things. So it's a composite construct that includes the psychological constructs of hope, resilience, of course resilience is there, optimism, of course, and self-efficacy. I would not agree that any of these traits are always good. Context always matters. Depending on means and ends, circumstances and goals, hope could be malicious or foolish. We may hope for the downfall of a rival colleague, or hope to hold a position for which we are not qualified or the most worthy. Resilience can be tragic. It's what people manifest in the face of systemic bias, suppression, disabling circumstances, and toxic workplaces. Maybe the best thing to do in a bad system is to walk away from it, not demonstrate resilience. Optimism could be blind and irrational. Despair can be appropriate. Sometimes the right thing to do is to adjust or abandon a goal rather than persevere. Self-efficacy could be irrelevant or inappropriate. Self-efficacy refers to your confidence that you can do something. But if you're not good at something, then you should have low self-efficacy for that task, because you should be letting other people, who are actually more competent, help you. And just because you can do something competently doesn't mean that you should. In an organization, we have to confine ourselves to working within the scope of our defined responsibilities. Sometimes the best thing to do is to let other people do their job. Such composite constructs form myths, even irrational ones. Here's an example: employee work passion. Employee work passion is an individual's persistent, emotionally positive, meaning-based state of well-being stemming from recurring cognitive and affective appraisals of various job and organizational situations that results in consistent, constructive work intentions and behaviors. Oh my. If you really think about it, that doesn't make sense. The word passion basically refers to engagement. Engagement in an activity, maybe one that you love. And maybe it brings you pleasure, and maybe that brings you suffering. But it cannot be persistently emotionally positive. It is not a state of well-being. Passion is passion. Well-being is another outcome. And it's supposed to stem from recurring thoughts and feelings about your job and your organization that make you behave in ways that management would consider consistent and constructive. What I'm identifying as the psychological myth of positivity assumes the automatic co-occurrence of different appealing states or traits into some composite construct that is a golden halo of everything desirable, yet the idea doesn't even make sense when you think about it. That definition is a phantasmagoria of positivity, positive feelings, positive thoughts, positive behavior, persistently and consistently, leading to uninterrupted personal pleasure, spiritual fulfillment, and productivity for self and others. I'm surprised that we try to build a science out of constructs like this. The flip side to the exaltation of the myth of positivity is the stigma of the myth of negativity. So if somebody has made a mistake, has failed at something, is ill, is low social status, or is different enough to make the privileged uncomfortable, we might also assume that they're simultaneously lazy, untrustworthy, dangerous, evil, and to be damned and excluded. You find it in the IO psychology theories that assume that a worker is bored and unhappy and stressed and unsatisfied and non-autonomous and unproductive and fragile, and that state is bad and should be avoided. You find it in the idea that some types of people are negative and toxic. There's no such thing as a negative person or a toxic employee, and speaking that way about anyone is dehumanizing. People interact with their environments and their social contexts in ways that are adaptive or maladaptive, skilled or unskilled, and they can all develop those skills. The myths of positivity and negativity, which I see everywhere in IO psychology, are so insidious because they make you believe that certain traits, states, or behaviors or environments are good or bad without any frame of reference, without reference to a context or goal. But there always is a frame of reference. There always is a social context, and we all have some agenda. When we assume that there's one world, we are in fact assuming one kind of microcosm, usually one of the privileged and powerful, represents the whole world. And then that functions to marginalize all the other real worlds that we don't want to know about. And when we assume that the people who tell us stories have no agenda, we give up our ability to assess the adaptivity of those narratives given our own context and goals. So we end up entangled in narratives that don't actually serve us well. They may prompt us to act harmfully. Critical theory is a tool we use to dismantle narratives, to uncover the power dynamics that underlie them. We can ask, who does the narrative privilege? Who does it marginalize? What does it rationalize? What does it make you do? And who does that serve? There's an ad there, and you're critically conscious enough to know that the function of that ad is to sell you shampoo. Now, in the 1990s, my cousin came to visit from Czechoslovakia just after the fall of the communist regime, and she actually believed the ads. She thought that she would buy that shampoo and wash her hair with it, and her hair would come out looking like that. Now, you know that's a hair ad, and the model's been photoshopped, and she's had her hair styled with fancy tools, and you know what, it's probably a wig anyway, and that it's just there to get you to buy the shampoo. And seeing that and knowing that, you can escape it and stand outside and above it. Right? You can shrug it off and spare yourself the disappointment and save some money and buy the store brand shampoo. Narratives have their greatest power when you aren't aware that they're narratives, when you believe that they're factual descriptions of reality and conduct yourself accordingly. That's when you, psychologically at least, lose your agency and become enslaved to someone else's agenda. That's when you buy the shampoo. By the way, my cousin was very disappointed after using it. Now, let's talk about hierarchy. You've asked me for insights from my personal experience. Okay, well, here they are. Here are behaviors I've noticed in other people toward me or toward others when we have a higher position in the social dominance hierarchy. People assume that my personal experience and insights are of great value. Sometimes they treat me like I'm above human, Once I was hanging out with a group of students, and one of the students there was surprised to learn that I was teaching. And he said, well, I thought you were one of us. And another student said, she's a person too. I was assumed to have some kind of status that put me above normal human. I've noticed that folks will attribute excellence and greatness to me. Thank you for teaching such a great course, and thank you for your excellent service to the department, are comments that have been made to me by people who never set foot in my classroom, who have never heard me lecture. But they assume that it must be great. I notice that they tend to refer to me by a title, like doctor or professor, even though I don't have a PhD and I'm not a professor. Asking questions like, how would you like to be addressed? Apologizing for having used my first name without asking permission when I used their first name without permission. Noticed a desire to please, thanking me even for things that I'm expected to do. I notice a lot of apologizing. If they ask me for something, they might apologize for having used my time at all. I've noticed that they save face for me. My legitimately poor performances are somehow perceived well. There's times when I've really messed up, but someone will come up to me and say, wow, that was really brave. Sometimes people will blame themselves for my mistakes. If I say something's posted on Brightspace and I actually didn't post it, students will say, I must be doing something wrong. I don't really know how to use the Brightspace, but I can't seem to find it, as if the issue was their lack of competence and not my error. People will ask me for permission or seek approval for things that I don't really have a role or an authority to judge. They'll also fear or resent my perceived disapproval. If students get a low grade in my class, they go trash me on Rate My Prof. I've noticed that gatekeepers let me through. It's when you can just walk past security like you own the place. I've noticed students waiting for me to enter the room first. 15 minutes before a lecture, you can just go into the room. But I'll notice students standing outside the empty room and then following me in once I get there. I get a lot of flattery. I'm quite plain looking, but I will get compliments on my appearance even when I'm badly dressed, when I have rolled out of bed, my hair's a rat's nest, I haven't brushed my teeth, I'm not wearing deodorant, and someone will say something like, oh wow, you look like you're going to have tea with the queen. And once I was so flabbergasted by that comment that I asked the lady who said that, why would you think that? And she said, well, you have a certain bearing. That sounds like status. A couple of weeks ago, I had a birthday, and someone said to me, oh, you must be turning, 19, 21? There is no way you can think I'm 19. My favorite piece of absurd flattery was somebody telling me, you remind me of the perfect birthday cake, eloquent, delicious, and tasteful. Now, whenever I feel like I don't know how I'm going to cope, I remind myself that I'm an eloquent birthday cake. Sometimes people will pretend to be my friend, and I'll think they really are, but they'll disappear after they get the grade or the reference they were really looking for. Notice people using avoidant conflict strategies, so they won't articulate their boundaries or they'll suppress their complaints. So if a student's unhappy and I could ask them one-on-one how things are going and, tell me if there's anything wrong, they'll say that everything's going well even when that's not true. And then they might write a scathing anonymous comment later. I've also dealt with undermining, so people using underhanded techniques in conflict, like rumor spreading and malicious gossip. Now, here are behaviors that I've noticed with people with higher status or power toward myself or to other people who have lower status. They'll refer to me by my first name while they expect to be referred to a title. They'll also refer to other higher status people by a title, like Dr. So-and-so. But I'm Tanya. They think that they're very important and special. Their research is high impact and world-renowned, groundbreaking, and their teaching and presenting is fascinating and scintillating. They think they know best, often based on little or no data, just opinion and personal experience. They act like the experiences of lower status people don't matter. They'll define a problem for me, decide the solution, and declare that it worked. And I never get the chance to say, no, that made everything worse. They treat lower status people with dismissal or disregard. They deny them voice. There's no forum in which they can contribute. They might not even see the jobs of lower status people as real jobs. They'll dismiss or disregard their boundaries and then trivialize their anger. I find they treat me like a child or a mental patient. They assume I have little or no relevant life or professional experience. I've never lived in the real world and lack basic survival skills. I might say that they're very proud of me for acting within the established range of my professional ability. I see that they're fragile. They expect respect, but they center their own comfort and pleasure. They're concerned about things that, in the big scheme of things, seem trivial, like incivility and reputation. Put a lot of effort into keeping up appearances, and they can be rude without knowing that they're being rude because nobody tells them when they are. They feel entitled to exploit those of lower status. They expect unpaid overtime, work for very low or no pay, and we'll call that organizational citizenship behavior. They act as if they're entitled to violate the legal and human rights of lower status people by engaging in discrimination, harassment, defamation, privacy violations. Then they'll rationalize it as appropriate or legitimate. I have seen people rationalize outright lies as perceptions. And they retaliate. If you try to report it, engage in denial, dishonesty, gaslighting, silencing, intimidation, threats, or deliberate social exclusion. And they won't apologize, but they'll tell you that you should let it go. When we talk about power and evil in organizations, we're often thinking about this guy or that guy at the head of the table. And since they all look the same, he needs a name. And I'm going to call him Max, and I'm going to call his right-hand man there Kevin. And all the others are called Joe. Max is powerful, he has high status, he's treated with deference, he expects compliant obedience, and he has a big ego, and he will do foolish, dangerous, and unethical things to protect his ego and his position. We actually can and should be disentangling these constructs like power and status and dominance, because they mean different things. Right? It's possible to have status without power, and it's possible to be simultaneously dominant and humble. We'll talk about dominance and submission, which is what power-blind, disingenuous IO psychologists mean when they talk about leadership and followership. And I'm going to examine these as the personality traits of disagreeableness and agreeableness. And finally, we'll look at concern for self versus others, which is what will bring me to evil in organizations. And we'll examine that as the personality traits of honesty and humility versus narcissism. So, what is power? Power is asymmetrical control over resources. Somebody who has power has more money, food, guns, whatever it needs to get the job done than others. People with power have agency. They get to do what they want. They set the agenda. They develop psychological distance. They are over and above it all. Develop a tendency to act unjustly, and they expect deference or obedience. Power distance in a culture is based on the subordinate's willingness to accept inequality. And power distance is rationalized with a social narrative. Right? Narrative is a guide for action, and it works best if you take it for granted. In reality, elites have limited resources for enforcement, and that's why myth is so important. I have some pictures there from the movie The Wizard of Oz, and Dorothy and her friends are so afraid of Oz, the great and powerful. And then they find that he's really a man behind a curtain pulling some levers. Much of what makes a great leader great is image. I like the metaphor of an elephant tied to a stake. A baby elephant can be tied to a small stake with a thin rope, but it's too small to get away. It learns that it can't. Then it grows into a big elephant, and even though it could easily break away, it doesn't, because it believes that it can't. The role of myth in power relationships is a bit like that. Now, when I say elites have limited resources for enforcement, they have a lot of resources if they're looking at you. So I like the metaphor of the eye of Sauron. So you can have a lot of latitude when their eye isn't on you because they only have limited resources for oversight and for monitoring. But if the eye were to turn on you, well then they have, compared to what you have, overwhelming resources to monitor you and to investigate you and to discipline you and punishment you. But the eye of Sauron doesn't look everywhere at once. So here are some myths that legitimize and perpetuate power. The myth of leadership is the idea that the person has power because of their inspirational vision that fills others with hope and motivates them to be their best selves. And everyone is a leader and everyone can be a leader. How sweet. In reality, power is restricted to a few, and those who have power hold the carrot and the stick that motivate people. They give rewards and deliver and control access to resources, and they administer punishment. The myth of greatness is the idea that everything about the leader is great, above and beyond the normal and the mediocre. People in positions of power will often overstate their reach and their impact and their accomplishments. In reality, leaders have some special talents and a lot of blind spots that they need others to fill. This one comes with a myth of personal responsibility. It's the idea that they got there on their own and stands on their own. No, leaders have a team and a lot of support. The myth of merit is the idea that the leader is the most deserving of that position. You assume that the leader is competent, but in reality, they're often put in their positions for political reasons, because of who they're associated with, because of who their dad is. Sometimes people get high-level jobs not because they're competent, but because higher-level leaders know that they can trust this person to toe the line. Sometimes the board of directors will just appoint the president, and that person's their puppet. This is how you end up with cronyism. The myth of belovedness is the idea that the leader has high popular support, is beloved by the people. In reality, maybe he hired all those people to show up at the rally, and his approval rating is 30%. The myth of caring is the idea, which people can really cleave to, that the leader cares about them personally and does things because they care. A leader with many subordinates doesn't have the cognitive or emotional capacity to be aware of, let alone care about, all their lived experiences. Workplaces are political spaces, and colleagues are not friends. There's a hard way to learn that. When it's a business, even an ethical leader has to make the right decision for the organization, and that can make letting people go, hurting their feelings. The myth of purity is the idea that the leader would never do a bad thing. They'd never lie, they'd never cover something up, they'd never take a bribe, they'd never do anything wrong or illegal. Many people who have power want power because they like power, and they will do unethical things to maintain and increase it. They'll never tell you that up front, and the myth has to be that they'd never do any wrong. And again, there's a hard way to learn that that's a myth. Power itself can be a myth. Leaders will bluster and intimidate and threaten, even where they have no real ability to follow through. Like a cat puffing itself up. Sometimes you'll hear people name-dropping connections that aren't actually going to be their reliable allies in practice. Sometimes there's more bark than bite. A good place to look for a company's myth and narrative is in the corporate propaganda, and you'll find that in the in-house magazine and on the company website. So that's power. Now, what is status? People who have high status have respected social positions, like being a teacher. People with low status have disrespected social positions, like panhandler. People with high status need to be seen as legitimate, as deserving of that position, through competent or ethical behavior. People with high status are almost universally believed to be competent, and ideally they actually are. They tend to act more justly, especially if they don't have power, because they have to buy the approval of the people who give them status. That means that they'll act well towards in-group members. It doesn't mean that they'll be just to out-group members. Can we divorce power from social status? Yes, we can, but it's tricky. So Vladimir Putin, and until recently Donald Trump, were men with a lot of real power. And despite his tremendous power, at least in the West, Putin does not have social status. He is a pariah and not invited to the coronation. We admire him about as much as we admire Hitler. But you might treat him with some respect because you know that he could hurt you. So social status always depends on social context. Putin has his base in Russia, even though many of us in academia think that Donald Trump is a buffoon. He has his base too, and with those folks, he has very high social status. Francis of Assisi and the Buddha were formerly wealthy and powerful men who made a choice to lay all that down in favor of their spiritual principles. And ironically, the more they did that, the more of their worldly material powers they laid down, the more moral authority they were given by others who were impressed with that. They both ended up being major influences. The term leader is perhaps really appropriate here. People are following because they like the vision and they trust the person's character. But that's not the same thing as power. That's not the same thing as sitting on a pile of money and commanding an obedient, violent army. Power and status are correlated. Status can be leveraged to gain power. Let's say that you're a social media influencer, but then you run for office, and now you have real power. The powers that be will claim moral authority legitimately or illegitimately. Modern managers try to align themselves with EDIA. 100 years ago, it would have been Christianity. So today you're reading a land acknowledgement before your meeting. Back then, it would have been the Lord's Prayer. Same difference. Even if you think that Putin is the scum of the earth, you'd be motivated to treat him respectfully, as if he had high status, because you know that he can hurt you. If you pissed him off enough, you could end up with polonium in your tea, which actually happened to someone. There you go. Now we've covered power and status, and I'm going to move into dominance and submission, which is what power-blind, disingenuous IO psychologists call leadership and followership. I'll explore that as behavior and as personality. While there are many practical reasons why things end up that way, leadership and followership, dominance and submission, do not essentially require a power difference to work. A good example of this is ballroom dance. The lead doesn't have more power than the follow. There's no coercion. There's no reward or punishment outside of how well they perform the shared task of coordinated dancing. They're equals, and it takes two to tango. What there is a division of labor or roles where the lead has the big picture strategy and controls the direction and choreography of the dance, provides a strong frame. And if that is executed well, it frees the follow, who's dancing backwards and can't see where they're going, to do the fancy, detailed stuff that doesn't require you to look where you're going, all those spins and the dips and the twirls. That requires trust. The follow can fall into a drop because they know they'll be caught. Another example is when someone helps you parallel park. That really requires trust, trusting that someone else has the right vision and can give you the right directions. Making that dynamic work does not require a power difference, but it does require a lot of other things. Shared goals, mutual respect, understanding of responsibilities, really caring, and excellent communication. In Quaker classrooms, there's no power difference between the teacher and the students. No use of titles. You don't need any of that to teach or to learn. And they characteristically sit in circles instead of having the kind of setup that we have in our classroom. This kind of equality can work between pairs and in small groups. In large groups and societies, you just don't have the ability to form relationships and communicate as effectively. And so we start to see more power differences as hierarchies develop, and the top becomes so high out of sight that they can't see the bottom anymore. There are differences in power in social life, and those differences are important. They predict and constrain behavior. They exist between individuals, and they exist between groups. Even over your own life, there'll be times when you have the power and the responsibility, and times when you're subject to somebody else's. That will vary across environments and contexts, like at home or at work, and across your lifespan. There are contexts in your life where you are dominant, even if it's only over your dog or your babysitting charges. And there are contexts in your life where you're submissive. We all have a boss, even if it's your parents. So what does the dynamic of dominance and submission look like? The dominant has control over the submissive or submissives, and the submissive person allows themselves or is controlled by the dominant person. Okay? So the dominant person administers rewards and punishments. The submissive is rewarded or punished. Dominant people have entitlements, and they have and use titles: Mr., Sir, Lord, Doctor, Your Honor, Officer, Professor, whereas the submissive is expected to demonstrate humility. The dominant imposes structure and initiates or intrudes, whereas the submissive yields. The dominant directs, the submissive trusts and obeys. The dominant supervises, the submissive is trained. The submissive is dependent on the dominant narrative to understand themselves. The submissive voice in you asks, "Who am I?" because it doesn't know. It asks, "Am I being a good student, a good employee, a good girl or boy? Or who should I be according to someone else's criteria?" The dominant part of you is self-affirming. It asserts, "I am who I say I am." It doesn't live in other people's images. The dominant person decides and acts. The submissive receives and reacts. The dominant person holds the frame and creates the structure. They decide what's right, true, appropriate, and funny. The submissive person acts within the frame or the structure. They seek permission and approval. The dominant judges. The submissive explains. The dominant assumes risk and responsibility and braves danger to protect and provide, to fulfill needs. The submissive seeks safety and presents needs. The dominant demonstrates strength and confidence, whereas the submissive demonstrates weakness and is fearful or anxious. The dominant person is parental, guiding, indulging, calm, whereas the submissive is childlike, playful, whimsical, and emotional. The dominant wants to be pleased, and the submissive wants to be pleasing. The anger of a dominant person or group is constructed as righteous, whereas the submissive is expected to be grateful, and they may feel shame. Shaming is a dominant move. The dominant is expected to be competent, and the submissive is expected to be obedient. Psychologically, the dominant needs to be needed, and the submissive wants to be wanted. According to Solomon's cognitivist theory of emotions, anger is something that's expressed between equals. It can be healthy. You set boundaries and redress grievances. Workplace conflict resolution programs are typically power blind, and they construct conflict as being between two equal status parties, when that's usually not the case. Anger is the emotion that's associated with dominance. So how does power affect the expression of anger? So the anger of the dominant person is seen as righteous. Toward a lower status person, it manifests as contempt, which is anger mixed with disgust. They'll exclude you without talking to you. They'll talk to you about others. They hope you'll just go away or that someone else takes you away. Anger is seen as inappropriate in lower status people, unless it's the frustration of having no control, in which case it justifies and rationalizes your subordination. Anger in lower status people manifests as resentment. Resentment is anger mixed with bitterness and fear. What are you going to do about your angry feeling? Maybe it's a feeling about unfairness that you're unable to correct. What are you going to do about your anger when you don't have the power or the permission or the safety to express it or to act on it? See people sulk, and they can fall into downward spirals. We can read power differences in nonverbal behavior. Smiling is considered a submissive gesture. It was noticed that during MMA matches, the one who smiles to the other opponent was more likely to lose the match. Smiling is an appeasement behavior, and dominant people will look serious or even angry. Seeming impressed is submissive. So is looking down, having wide open eyes, or breaking eye contact. Staring is dominant. Submissive behaviors make the body look smaller and less threatening. So anxious behaviors like self-stroking or biting the nails or fiddling with the hair. Anything that makes you look more unbalanced, so twisting your body. Dominant people will stand, say, with their legs placed apart as if they were kind of ready to take on a fight. They might have their hands in fists. Sometimes you'll see men like that with their thumbs in their belt loops. Submissive people will have limp wrists or have the palms up. And another sign is clothing that looks sort of soft and yielding versus clothes that is structured and tailored. So here's an example from the Game of Thrones of some characters before they had, when they were relatively disempowered, and then when they seized the power. And what differences can you see there? You can see that their hairstyles become more structured. There's less use of these soft and pastel colors. Right? They're wearing bolder, darker colors. And their clothes have clear, clean edges. We're not going for soft and flowy. Dominant people will make decisions and statements that tend to be shorter. Submissive people will talk more. They'll write longer emails. There's more explaining and reporting and checking in because they need the approval. You'll hear submissive people make a statement with the intonation of a question. So instead of saying, "the sky is blue," they would say, "the sky is blue?" You can influence people simply by lowering the pitch of your voice in the first moments of a conversation, because dominant people have lower voices or speak in lower voices. For women, that's the vocal fry range. This is vocal fry. It sounds unimpressed and serious. There's actually a lot of misogynistic online hate about women with vocal fry. This is a snip from page 551 of the Miranda article. It shows that dominant, higher power people are more likely to just ask for what they want bluntly and impolitely. They're more likely to be rude. Subordinates are more likely to ask for what they want in really vague, ambiguous ways. So ambiguous that it's called off the record in this paper, because you might not even recognize what they're asking you. You have to read between the lines and figure it out. Or they will simply not make the request. When they want to be friendly, dominant people tend to assume intimacy with you. They might touch you or ask you about your personal life in a way that you would not dare do to them because they could be insulted and rebuke you. Submission is about obedience. But obedience is something we can distinguish from conformity. Obedience is obeying someone with higher rank or power. Obedience relies on social power. Conformity is going along with other people of social status. It doesn't require any power difference. And it's more about the need to be socially accepted. So obedience involves an order, and conformity involves a sort of perceived expectation. In this picture, everyone is wearing the same outfit. If that is the dress code of the company, then all those people are being obedient. But if we're just doing what everyone else is doing, even because that's been modeled by the leader, then that's conformity. You might remember Solomon Ash's Conformity Experiments. And what he did was show people a line, the standard line. And then they ask, which of the three comparison lines is the same length? Well, it is plainly obvious that it is number 2. But what Ash did is have a bunch of other people in the room, Confederates, who said that it was line 1. The photo on the right was taken after 5 people, who are all Confederates of the experimenter, answered line 1. And the student in the center shows the severe discomfort that comes from not going along with the responses of the other group members. So in these experiments, about 1/3 of people agree, and they say that it's also line 1. When they do that, there's no coercion, but it's still really hard for them. Why do they do that? Maybe they think that the other people must be right. And that could be adaptive. Sometimes the other people in our lives know what they're doing and we follow along. You'll remember the Milgram Experiments from intro psychology. Those experiments show that most people will do what they are told, even if it's something cruel and terrible. And this was more than 1/3 of people. It was 2/3 of people that were obedient. Now, that only worked under the condition that the dominant person was taking the responsibility and that they're just following orders. When they told subjects that they would be responsible if the person they were purportedly shocking had a heart attack, they all refused to continue. So, as long as the dominant person's taking the responsibility, people are quite willing to follow orders. Those experiments also showed us that to get people to do terrible things, you start with small requests, and then, as they obey those, you start ramping up the expectations. And it gets to the point that they're doing something that they never would have agreed to do if you asked them in the first place. It doesn't make sense to construct conformity or obedience or dominance or submission versus independence as good or bad. Are you conforming to the fact that the other students are doing their readings before class or binge drinking on the weekends? Are you obeying the traffic lights and the rules of the road, or are you obeying Stalin or Putin? The rules of the road make sense. They're fair. They keep us safe. It's adaptive to follow the rules of the road. If we didn't have those or follow those, there would be some really big, tragic, preventable problems. But that's not the case for Stalin's or Putin's policies. So maybe the question is, if you're dominant, are you a good leader? If you're submissive, do you know how to pick a good lead? And can you walk away from one who isn't? So I invite you to think critically about who and what you're obeying or conforming to and why. Be aware of when you're going along with something and what you're being told to do and what that means given your own context and goals. There are individual differences in people's orientations to dominant or submissive behaviors. Some people want to be in charge, and some people want to be taken care of. So let's go back to our psychological contract activity. all of you have the same status in my class as students. But given that, some of you acted in ways that were submissive and some of you acted in ways that were not. It's not right or wrong. Every comment here was appropriate, but it's interesting to observe the differences. So here are some comments that I would code as submissive. Assuming that my personal insight or experience is of great value. Asking me what my ideal student is and for tips on how to be that person. Asking me what I find disrespectful, that you may not disrespect me. Now here are some comments that were not submissive. And maybe they're coming at me on equal footing, maybe they're coming from a more dominant place, but the point is, this is not submissive. Asking me to respect your boundaries. It can actually be really hard for people in subordinate roles to set boundaries with people who are up a power gradient. Telling me bluntly what you want. And setting expectations and standards. This is one of my favorites. I would like the professor and TA to be understanding and reasonable in grading, which I know they would be. That's setting an expectation. If I were to say, I know that you will have your assignments handed in on time. And then providing critical feedback. I got called out on having 30 questions. Maybe that's not a quiz, it's really a test. Fair enough. But giving criticism, setting expectations, setting boundaries, and asking for what you want are not characteristically submissive behaviors. I want to bring your attention to the personality trait of agreeableness versus disagreeableness. Please be aware that personality traits are normally distributed. We tend to talk about people as if they were out on those green tails of the distribution. So we talk about people as if they were either introverts or extroverts. But most people aren't classic extroverts or introverts. Most people fall in the middle of the distribution and they're actually ambiverts. Okay? Your classic introverts and extroverts are much less frequent. So if we're to talk about one of those tails, the very disagreeable tail, well, what are disagreeable people like? They're dominant or independent. It's hard to make them do things that they're not interested in. They want to be respected. They can be judgmental and critical. And what that means is that they have or they impose a framework of how things should be. They don't easily trust others. If you cross them, they will follow up on that. They are stubborn. They're willing to argue and hold their ground and say no. They can be confrontational or provocative. They insult people and may not really be concerned that somebody was insulted. Their attitudes may seem irreverent, and I think that can make them quite funny. Their key emotion is anger. If they're narcissistic, they'll be angry about what they perceive as mistreatment or disrespect of themselves, and they might be willing to retaliate unethically. If they're honest or humble, they'll be concerned with the mistreatment of others or other systemic problems. It's your classic social justice warrior type. So what are agreeable people like? Well, they're submissive. They go along to get along. They want to keep the peace. They're lenient and tender-minded. So if you had a poor performance, they might say, oh, well, but you were tired and your mother was sick and you were going through all these things. Save face for you. They're forgiving. They are willing to trust and like people who have harmed them, and that makes them very exploitable. They're yielding. They compromise and cooperate and accommodate others even when those other folks are being unreasonable. They want to be pleasing, so they'll do things that don't interest them to be of service. They're conflict avoidant, and it's for this reason that I'm hesitant that very agreeable people are suited for leadership, unless they develop assertiveness skills, because you cannot be a leader if you're conflict avoidant. You need to say no, because people will ask you to do things that are unethical, and it's on you to say no and not please them. Right? Agreeable people can have a really hard time with that and get drawn into things that they should know better than to do. They don't have the quickness to anger that characterizes disagreeable people. They have a characteristic of gentleness or mildness. So, how do you equalize a power dynamic? That actually might not be possible because power dynamics in organizations are structural. They're about positions and authority and budgets, and the ability to retaliate. And you can't change the structure. If you have power, you can act friendly and respectful to subordinates. You can use something called positive politeness, which are behaviors like informal, friendly ways of acting and speaking that say, we're all part of the same group. We're all friends here. However, you do have to understand that subordinate people can have a hard time communicating when they're feeling uncomfortable. And they might not want you to be their friends, and they might be really insulted to be patted on the shoulder or the head, but they might not feel able to say that to you. So that's why I said friendly and respectful. If you don't have power, you could try acting familiar with superiors or speaking directly and bluntly, and they might accept that, and that might empower you, or it might not work for you because you don't have the power. Transactional analysis recommends an adult-adult dynamic. That's acting with the implicit assumption, I'm an adult and you're an adult. If you act like a parent, critical, judgmental, smothering, nurturing, for better or worse, you're inviting the other person to act like a child. Rebellious, petulant, sullen, defiant, playful, fun, spontaneous. And if you act like a child, then you're inviting the other person to act like a parent. Acting like an adult to another adult means being rational and grounded, present here and now, not threatening and not threatened. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do. This brings me to evil. Evil does exist in people and in organizations. People do things intentionally or unintentionally that are unethical and that harm the greater social good. Harassment and discrimination are endemic in organizations, though all organizations pretty much have to say that they won't stand for this, and there's a process for reporting it if it does happen. In practice, it does happen, and those processes can be abused, and they can be unsafe and ineffective. Managers can and do break the law. They make risk management decisions and cost-benefit decisions. I might ask, how much profit will they make by doing something they shouldn't do? How likely are they to get sued? And what's their budget for lawsuits? OD wants to get people to confront issues openly and directly, but in practice, managers often prefer to cover things up. Sometimes that's through silencing or intimidation. Draw your attention back to our personality model, and now to a domain called honesty humility. What are people with low honesty humility like? Well, they're narcissistic. They are focused on themselves and on self-promotion. This is a trait that has come down to us through the ages because it has an evolutionary advantage, that of self-selection. If you can act in ways that get yourself the resources, well, then you will survive and reproduce and pass along that trait. Unfortunately, they'll act in ways that are unfair or corrupt. They'll cheat, steal, or take advantage of others. They'll lie and manipulate to get what they want. They're Machiavellian. That means they have political skills, and actually you really need those to survive in a political environment. They might laugh at your jokes even if they think they aren't funny to score points with you, or spread rumors and undermine you if that's what works for them. They like hierarchy, and they want money, power, and status, and they like to display it. They feel entitled to special treatment, feel like they're superior, and deserve more respect. They might feel like they're above the law. That's why they break it. They'll do risky, impulsive things out of boredom. and they can be unethically vengeful. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum. High honesty or humility. People with high honesty and humility are focused on others and community. The evolutionary advantage for this is called kin selection. And what this means is that if a family has, one or two kids with this trait out of all their children, the parent who has one out of a few children like that will be selected, if only because the other children are more likely to survive. And so that trait gets passed down. They're unconcerned with self-promotion. They're less likely to exploit others. They have traits of sincerity, integrity, and fairness. They're able to admit mistakes and will try to correct them. They don't think they're better than anyone else, and they're less interested in money or prestige or sort of status environments. They're more level-headed, and they don't engage in the kind of antisocial behavior that narcissistic people do. So they don't believe that two wrongs would make a right. And this trait is associated with better job performance. Since honesty and humility is a socially desirable trait, narcissistic people therefore must claim it. And this results in hypocrisy. They will lie that they're honest, or they will brag or exaggerate about being modest or honest. You'll notice virtue signaling, which is when they'll signal their morality with words, but not follow through with actions. And virtues are based on action. So virtue signaled is virtue corrupted. They're more concerned with the appearance of doing and being good than actually doing and being good. Another thing you'll notice is savior narratives. Disadvantaged children are the ideal targets for the charity of narcissists because they have no voice, they can't object, and they look good in pictures. There is no accountability for the results of their charity. The effects are not measured. There may never have been a problem to solve. Maybe they brought food to children who were already well fed. And if there are any iatrogenic effects, for example, they had teenagers build homes in villages that were not up to code, where the villagers actually had way more construction experience than the teenagers, well, they don't acknowledge or manage the harm that could do. The opinion of the people that they have helped does not really matter. It won't be collected in any systemic or transparent way. They will be spoken for. Positive testimonials will be found. They want attention and accolades for their helping. They will take credit for the success of the helped, even if it was those people that really helped themselves. And they benefit from the attention and the approval, which I'll note also serves to protect them from criticism. So it might be hard to say that this person had bullied you, because look at what she does for the children. She must be the nicest person in the world. Here are some critical questions to ask about interventions. Did the people who are being helped actually ask for help? They have a chance to participate in defining the problem. Did they give their consent to the intervention? Did they have the opportunity to give their feedback? Openly? Freely? Was it on 1 to 5 scales on questions that were already decided for them, or could they give qualitative feedback? Were they showed the report of the feedback, and were any changes made? And was there any redress for them if they were harmed? You can ask how effectiveness is being measured. Is it just positive anecdotes? What happened to the negative anecdotes? If there was some experiment, what was the rigor of that experiment? For instance, was there a control group? If you look at anti-bullying interventions, it's normal for bullying to decrease from junior high school to high school. So if you have a bullying program, start it in junior high, and you show that bullying has been reduced by high school, well, it would have done that without the program. You need a control group. And then, did you consider the opportunity cost? Because if you come into, say, schools and run interventions that are not effective, you have taken away the student's time from having done something better. That's called opportunity cost. Pictures there are from the DARE program. It's when police officers come into schools and they tell you how drugs are bad, and the program is actually iatrogenic. It's associated with increased drug and alcohol use. But people love this program, and it's still around. That shows that optics and appearances are more important than evidence. Culture is the flip side of leadership, so if you have leaders with narcissistic traits, you end up with an organization with a narcissistic culture. Narcissistic people will sacrifice organizational goals and the common good for the sake of their ego. They will promote flatterers to positions that they shouldn't be in. They will cover up mistakes. They will save face. They will take big foolish risks because they think they know better. They overestimate their knowledge, their skills, and their entitlements. Sometimes they live in fantasy worlds. That's what we mean by capacity to test reality. They do not handle criticism well. You can't tell them they're wrong, and that's a problem because often they are, because they overestimate their knowledge and their skill. They assume that they'll get away with unethical behavior, and often they do. But sometimes it comes back to bite them. A narcissistic culture will have a retention problem. Sometimes people finally realize they're being exploited and leave. Narcissistic leaders can run a company into a ground with foolish decisions, and that eventually affects the bottom line. Then, your salaries aren't going to be competitive, and even if people aren't being actively mistreated, it means they'll still be able to find a better deal somewhere else. So you'll end up, one way or another, with a turnover problem. People stay in narcissistic cultures because they believe the myths. They believe they're so lucky to be working there, and their leader is so great. They'll keep going as long as they believe the myths. Ironically, those who want power probably shouldn't have it. Power and narcissism are so correlated because narcissistic people want power. They seek and enjoy power. Also, power functions to encourage people to become self-absorbed and entitled. People with power develop psychological distance. They start acting unjustly. Power corrupts. That's why it's so important to have checks and balances on power. That means oversight from regulatory bodies outside the organization. Humans run narcissistic. We usually think about ourselves. We project ourselves onto other people. We use our own experiences as an anchor to make inferences about other people. We have cognitive biases that are self-serving. We happily assume personal responsibility for success and then blame others or the environment for failures. Even if you end up scoring a 5 out of 5 on the honesty, humility subscale of the HEXACO, there's a time in your life that you've lied or manipulated and rationalized it too, and you'll continue to experience the temptation to do so. Talk about personality traits as something you were born with and something that will be stable for the rest of your life, but you can also see them as skills that develop over your lifetime. You learn sometimes through difficult experience how small you are, how much you need other people, and how little you know, and how you're not actually entitled to some of the things that you expect. We have to work hard to be aware of or sensitive to other people's perspectives, experiences, and needs. If you have power, you have to work really hard to do that because people are too scared to tell you. Another cultural myth is that the susceptibility to be evil is the special domain of the able-bodied white man. There is, in fact, a gender difference in personality, such as narcissism is higher in men. However, we know that women have a tendency to sexually select men with wealth and power, so you can just as well blame women for friend-zoning the nice guys. This trait is in every human and every human group. So call it the fallenness of humanity. Non-profit feminist organizations that advocate for victims of domestic abuse can be internally politically corrupt and toxic. I've seen that. The pre-colonial Americas were not the Garden of Eden. The power games of the Incan Empire were violent and involved armies and conquests. Slavery existed in Africa since ancient times, and it's still practiced there today. It's in me, it's in you, in your enemies, in your allies, in your leaders, and in your subordinates. I think there is tremendous danger in ever thinking that you are above it. You never get to brag about being humble. I want to take a moment to discuss an evil that you may encounter. One of my teaching objectives for this course is to give you your money's worth, and this might just be it. Because workplace mobbing, like power, is something that we don't talk about in psychology. Bullying and mobbing are endemic in organizations. Bullying refers to behavior that is intended to harm the target. It's not just friendly teasing. There is a power difference that favors the perpetrator or perpetrators. And it's not just one incident. It's something that occurs over time, maybe even a few months, in the context of a relationship. There are 3 forms of bullying: physical, verbal, and social. In practice, the kids who are physical and verbalies don't tend to go so far in professional life. Punching somebody, cursing them out will get you into trouble. However, the social bullies actually do quite well, and you might end up working for them. When you encounter bullying in the workplace, this is something that you might be dealing with. So what is social bullying? It looks like malicious gossip, rumor spreading, ganging up, and exclusion. So who gets bullied? Well, they tend to be competent, ethical people who are perceived as a threat. If somebody's actually a bad employee, somebody has bad behavior or poor performance, you can legitimately dismiss them. A bigger problem to the manager with an evil streak is the good employee that's a threat, perhaps because of their competence, perhaps because they're a whistleblower. They're seen as insufficiently respectful of their superiors. And if you're an internal OD practitioner who calls out management or blows the whistle, this could happen to you. Social bullying becomes mobbing when it spreads to managerial networks and organizational processes. So organizations have HR processes around complaints and discipline that can, in practice, be quite biased and harmful, especially when the HR folks who run them aren't trained in any kind of investigation. They may not be compliant with privacy legislation. They may not be compliant with professional standards for appropriate dispute resolution. They can be pretty scary processes. So there are 5 stages of mobbing, and the purpose of a mobbing is to exclude someone from the workplace. So at the end stage, the person goes on sick leave, they quit, they retire, or they are fired. But there's a process that gets up to that. So the first stage is exclusion. So the person is gossiped about or stigmatized, but they don't know what's happening to them. And stage 1 can go on for a few months without the person really knowing. They might sort of suspect something. They might wonder, why does everyone stop talking when I walk into the room? Right? They might notice some things, but generally they're pretty oblivious. Then it starts to escalate, right? And at level 2, which is the stage of petty harassment, that's when they realize that something's going on. That's when they deal with verbal harassment, being dressed down or chewed out at a meeting, being written up. That's when they get the nasty emails. That's when their workspace is moved to the basement. A person can only take so much of that, especially when it's outrageously unfair. Finally, the person snaps and they say something or do something regrettable. Maybe they say, "I wish I could strangle my boss." And then they gotcha. And at that point, if it hasn't already happened, you get ensnared in the organizational processes. So organizations have informal and formal processes for complaints and disciplines that, as I've said, can be tremendously biased. So at this point, they might go looking for complaints. They might ask people, "Have you ever had a negative experience with this person? Have they ever made you uncomfortable?" In the power dynamic of an organization, if it's clear that management has it out for you, people can score points by reporting on you. So you might end up being scapegoated. Sally might accuse you of having groped her when that was actually somebody else, maybe some manager who she's not able to confront, but now here's an opportunity to get somebody in trouble. Those formal processes ultimately end with the person being somehow removed from the workplace. The mechanism that propels the process of mobbing is called unethical communication. It's things like gossip and rumors. It's meetings held behind your back where you are talked about and accused but cannot defend yourself. You don't even know that it's happening. It's decisions being made in meetings or in emails instead of through a fair and transparent process. It's the fact that if you have a process, maybe the other side will get a private audience with HR where they're able to set the narrative and set the agenda and make clear how you're to be treated and what's to be thought of you. And so you end up walking into some kind of a rigged kangaroo court when you're expecting a fair process. Accordingly, one of the best ways to manage this is through privacy compliance. People can get really caught up in defending themselves in what's true and in what's not true. But you can shut down the whole discussion by saying, that's privacy, that's private, or, this isn't the right forum for that. You can use privacy to excuse people from the discussion and to stop that kind of conversation, which shouldn't really be happening. Red flags for workplace bullying. Well, you might be hearing about someone that you wouldn't normally be hearing about. You might be asked to do something to exclude or to attack somebody, to not invite them to something, to take them off a mailing list, to send them an accusatory message, maybe something of a disciplinary nature, that has been drafted for you that you are supposed to sign and send. And might be asked to violate somebody's privacy by sharing, say, sensitive or confidential information about them. The accusations against the person will be vague. There will be heavy use of insinuation. In a couple of cases, I've seen the person accused of staring. They were staring at somebody and it made people feel uncomfortable. Well, maybe they were just looking in somebody's direction. Their behavior will be described in incredibly general ways as negative, as inappropriate, provocative, or concerning, but there won't be any clear incident and outcome. There'll be these vague, negative generalities that, if they get at any instance, probably really trivial. You'll hear narratives of concern, of safety, and of discomfort. Reporting concerns is a good way to bully because the language of concern conceals rumor spreading and malicious gossip under the cloak of caring. We're just concerned because we want this to be a psychologically healthy workplace. And as for those attacks, well, they were just bringing the concerns to your attention right before your big deadline. This connects to the legal defense of qualified privilege. If you are a manager reporting what other people say, well, then it's not defamation. You're just reporting what other people are saying. Now, maybe those are people that have ganged up on the target and are scoring points for the manager for making the accusations. But nevertheless, it is an effective legal defense from defamation. Bullying tends to leverage stereotypes. So if the target is a woman, then there'll be an insinuation that she's sexually promiscuous. If the person is mentally ill, they could be unstable. The man's a sexual harasser. The black person's a thief. The white person's racist. The Muslim person is violent. The point of using this stereotype is that it lends credibility to the rumors because people believe in stereotypes. It is possible to survive what is known as constructive dismissal. The most important principle is to never react to attempts to provoke you, because the function of those attacks is to drive you towards perpetrating the critical incident. You must remain calm and gracious because you will still be accused of inappropriate behavior, so you might as well not supply it. And expect to be targeted at key moments, like when you are in front of other people. You're best advised to trust no one on the inside. HR works for management. If management has it out for you, HR isn't going to be your friend. The corporate lawyer also works for management. I've never known anyone in this kind of situation who was asked to share information with a lawyer have that go well for them, right? The job of an organization's lawyer is to protect that organization from legal threats. And if you are being victimized, if you are being discriminated against or harassed, and you're reporting that, that kind of makes you the threat. It's generally best to focus on your work, emphasize privacy. If you talk about it in the workplace, you risk disclosing something that you shouldn't disclose. You risk spreading defamation around if you talk about it. You can't really defend yourself from defamation by saying, hey, these guys are spreading a rumor that I did X, without the person that you're talking to now hearing that you did X. Do not put yourself in vulnerable positions, like being alone in person with the perpetrators. And then they can say that you did something, and the other two will act as the false witnesses. It's best not to make personal disclosures, because anything you disclose can and will be used against you. Best to hold your cards close to your chest. You don't need to tell them what your next move is, because that gives them time to respond and react. Keep all the records, and in the end, you can take that to some kind of tribunal. The best book I know on this subject is the one in the picture there by Janice Harper. If this happens to you or someone you care about, remember this and go get that book. Humans have been mobbing and scapegoating each other for a very long time. This is the same process that we saw in witch hunts 500 years ago. But humans aren't the only species that engage in mobbing. The other one of them is birds. Sometimes a whole lot of little birds will go after a big bird and harass it. And what do we see? Well, the big bird sort of puts up with it without retaliating, and eventually when they've had enough, they'll fly off. The key is that they don't fight back. And that's because if they did, they'd lose all the energy. So you're usually best off simply not responding to most attacks. Mobbing is a temporary career crisis that will usually be over in about 3 months. 3 months of hell for you before it ends. And what typically happens in the end is that other people will start stepping forward for you to say, hey, I don't think this person is so bad. They'll start to realize that it's all trumped up. That said, the advice of pretty much everyone I know in the industry is that you're best off leaving a toxic workplace sooner rather than later with your sanity and finances intact.
Now let's look at this picture again. The meeting in the boardroom of Organization B. I was really impressed when you so astutely noticed that there was something different about that guy. Kevin. The alpha, Max, does not stand on his own. He has an entourage, a retinue, a group of trusted advisors or assistants. I'm going to call them the betas. They are, because of their association with him, note that this is part of the psychosocial substructure of the organization, They are disproportionately powerful and protected given their official positions in the organization. Because he likes and trusts them, he will give them positions that they probably aren't the ideal candidate for. This is how you end up with political appointments to positions. They can include everyone from low-level staff to executives. They'll restrict access to him and even his access to others. However, their power comes from him, and so they have to stay in his good books. They might not tell him things that he wouldn't be happy to hear. This is why Putin probably doesn't know how badly things are going in the Ukraine. Would you want to be the general that tells him? They also do his dirty work. If Max has it out for you, he's not going to get his own hands dirty coming after you. He's too busy, important, and smart for that. He's going to stay above it all where he can keep his hands clean. So something like this will happen. Kevin will indicate to the Joes that there's some concern about you, and the Joes will dutifully report everything bad you've ever done or could do, and some of them will even make it up. They'll report all of that to Kevin, who will be well pleased and protect them. This is all very confidential, you know. Now, Max is just acting on this report from Kevin because he's concerned. As a manager, he's responsible for ensuring that Organization B is a psychologically healthy workplace. So he's going to need to do something about this. Fun fact, the industry term for the folks who gang up and come after you when a manager has it out for you are called flying monkeys. It's a Wizard of Oz reference. While some are in it for the malicious fun, many are just somehow set up to come after you. They might not know what they're doing. They've just been told to say, rebuke you for something that they've been set up to believe you actually did. This basically sets them up to pick a fight with you, and you will lose energy, focus, and potential allies by letting that happen. There may be some way to gently and diplomatically correct them, but pouring your just rage upon them is not going to work in your favor. Don't fall into that trap.
So we've talked about some of the evil things that managers who are being evil might do. And I imagine that this is not the kind of manager that you want to be. Let's say that you want to be a good leader. Then I propose that you should strive to be three things. Those are competent, caring, and ethical. If you would presume to make decisions for other people, you need to be competent. People will trust and believe that you are competent. It's important that you really are. If you aren't competent at your job, you really shouldn't be doing it. Would you want to see an incompetent doctor? Take a class from a teacher who's full of BS? Would you want to trust your money to a banker who doesn't really know how to invest? No. To be worthy of power, you also need to be honorable. That's the basis for trust because anyone who has power can abuse it. That's your characteristic of honesty and fairness. These three traits make up a functional trinity. You have to be all three in order to be a good leader. It's not ethical to be incompetent because you'll cause harm. You can't care and allow yourself to act that way. If you have power, you'll have psychological distance from the subjects of your power, so you won't even know about their lived experience of the structures that you create if you don't care enough to find out. If you don't care about people, you may not realize when your principles and the processes that you're diligently following are actually causing harm or not care enough to change them. Thank you for your attention. You're welcome to send me your questions or comments, or we can talk about them when we meet in class on Thursday. For next class, please read Chapter 4 on the role and style of the OD practitioner.